Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda sedang menonton rakaman khas agenda AWANI di sisi IACC. Satu persidangan antarabangsa yang buat pertama kalinya berlangsung di Malaysia. Terima kasih kepada MACC kerana membolehkan saya melakukan diskusi ini. Oleh itu, saya ingin meminta izin bicara bahasa Inggeris. I would like now to welcome a very honoured guest for today on the sideline of IACC, which is Stuart McWilliam, the senior campaigner for money laundering unit for Global Witness. I guess I'll let you introduce what Global Witness is, but my understanding is Global Witness look at the global world and for corruption specifically, for your unit specifically, where's the money trail? I guess like that must be one of the things.
That's absolutely right. So what we look at is how, when corrupt officials steal money from their state budget or they take bribe payments, how are they able to then hide that and make it look clean and spend it without getting caught? And what we find is that there's various things you need as a corrupt official. One, you need a bank that's willing to take your money. Secondly, you need some kind of anonymous company to hide your identity. And thirdly, you need probably a lawyer or an accountant or some kind of professional that helps to set the deals up to allow you to move the money without being discovered. And it's precisely the role of international banks and lawyers and others that we look at, and the people we say facilitate corruption, the people who enable corruption to happen.
So for you and your organization, corruption is definitely global.
It's definitely a global problem. It's prevalent in lots of countries around the world, most countries around the world. And actually, you know, some people think that corruption only happens, you know, in certain parts of the world. But actually, you know, we find that it's banks and lawyers and others that set up companies.
That's the part I want to go right now, because, you know, it's not always that Global Witness comes across Astro AWANI's focus. And when I read about efforts fighting corruption, and myself and my friends in AWANI has been with the MACC, for example, and we've come a long way, set up, change the laws, enact new laws, have a special court, all in the name of expediting things, you know, taking out the bureaucracy and making it more efficient and effective. But just like any other crime, the crime perpetrators will always seemingly be 2 steps ahead. They find loopholes in the system, they innovate and make whatever they do more sophisticated, for example. So is it right to have that perspective that we are always fighting a group of people or an individual or a network that are very, very in tune with high tech, with having the best of advice and expertise, be it law or in finance, for example, or is it the other way around?
I think it's a bit of both. So it's true that there are a group of people who will help corrupt officials set up very complicated deals, and we'll find new ways to do that. And it's important we try and shut down the existing ways. They'll find new ways. But sometimes it's very easy. It's too easy for corrupt officials to steal money. So one example of that is, you know, banks are supposed to check whether who all their customers are, and in particular whether they are people with access, you know, politicians with access to the government budget, or their family members or business associates.
FAPs.
That's right. And if they are, banks are supposed to do checks to see whether the sources of their fund are actually legitimate or not. It's a basic check, but actually a lot of banks don't do those checks. So you don't necessarily need to set up a complicated scheme to launder money. Sometimes you can just do it in a very simple way, and the institutions, the banks, who are supposed to be the first line of defence against money laundering, don't do the basic checks.
Let's get the scenario right. Many banks around the world have all these checks.
They're supposed to.
But there's also a number of banks, which is many according to the report by Global Witness. Maybe not the majority, but the size is still enough for international corruption money to flow around.
That's absolutely right. And you know, one example from the UK banking regulator did a review only 4 years ago into how well banks are doing the checks to identify, you know, corrupt officials. And they found that 75% of banks weren't doing the right, you know, weren't doing enough. 75% of banks, that's, you know, that's huge. And, you know, we've seen all around the world where regulators have found that banks aren't doing enough and corrupt money has got into the system. So there are a lot of good banks who are doing the right thing, but there's certainly enough that aren't, to mean that basically the financial system is leaving a wide open door for corrupt officials to launder money.
Okay, I have to go for the first break, but once we are back, what hope is there? And we have always to have hope. So, from a global witness point of view, after the break, let's discuss how you guys are fighting it from your standpoint, especially the word banks appear every time I read any literature of global witness. So let's focus on banking, and also fighting corruption right after this short break. Hi, you're still watching a special recorded session of Agenda AWANI on the sideline of a very important meet and conference, IACC, the anti-corruption conference where everyone from around the world is here, and around the world that matters, of course. And I have one from Global Witness. Thank you so much again, Stuart, for being here. But I want to focus like what I promised before. And I want to quote the quote that was quoted inside the report of a Global Witness that I'm reading from Elizabeth Warren, the US Senator. If large financial institutions can break the law and accumulate millions in profit, and if they get caught, settle by paying out of those profits, they do not have much incentive to follow the law. I mean, the no-brainer statement will be power corrupts and power corrupts, absolutely. Money corrupts and money corrupts, absolutely. And then we have this quote. So what I'm thinking is, if I represent a lot of people from the developing nation and the poor countries, if this is coming out of the most advanced nation, then what hope is there? What are you guys doing for Global Witness that give you hope that this can be changed?
Well, we're doing two main things, and you're right, it's absolutely important to have hope. So the quote by Elizabeth Warren is really important, and what she's getting at is actually the reason that banks have been facilitating corruption, despite lots of laws that should prevent them from doing that, is because they have no incentive to follow those laws. And the reason that's the case is because it's rare that banks get caught taking the proceeds of corruption. When they do, the punishment tends to be a fine to the bank as a corporation, which gets passed on to shareholders. What doesn't happen is the individuals at the banks, the senior executives who are responsible for making sure the bank doesn't take the proceeds of corruption, they rarely face any consequences. And so that's something we've been calling for a long time, and Elizabeth Warren is one of many different senators across the US, both on the Republican and the Democratic side. Now, we've had some success campaigning in the UK, where we've been calling for senior executives to be held personally responsible. And the UK government and the banking regulator has just introduced a new measure called the Senior Managers Regime, where a named individual executive at every UK bank has to have personal responsibility for making sure their bank doesn't take the proceeds of corruption. That will be coming into force in March next year, and that gives the UK a really important opportunity to give executives the incentive to make sure their banks don't take any dirty money, which is great. Now, we'd like to see that across Europe, we'd like to see that in the US and other places. So that's one big hope for you know, banks doing a better job. The second thing that needs to be done, and we're working on, is something that makes it very easy for corrupt officials to move money around. It's easy to set up a company without declaring your ownership of it. So what will happen is someone will set up a company, they'll transfer money from the state government into those accounts, And that will normally be owned by another company in another country where it's impossible to know who the real owners are. So if you're a corrupt official, you set up the secret company, steal the money, move it around several countries and into your own bank account. Now, what we've been calling for is a ban to that. We've been calling for governments to introduce a central list of who owns companies, and the UK government has introduced that, or is introducing that, and it will be the first in the world. The European Union has passed similar legislation, which isn't quite as strong, but will come into force, and so we're calling on the US government to do the same thing, and for governments all around the world to do that. And I think that's the second big hope, that something can be done.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but when we watch movies, that's exactly what you have described. Like, you know, some Caribbean country somewhere, and then move down to some African country somewhere, and then maybe some Asian country somewhere. They will go to where that particular national set of rules, laws, and regulation will not require them to state who the real owners are. So the global fight for global witness is making sure every country on earth will have to have that same standard. But that's a huge challenge.
It's a big challenge, but like all big campaigns, they tend to last for 10, 15 years. You know, if you look at all the big campaigns in history, they weren't achieved overnight. But important things, you know, need to be kind of continued and stayed with. So the UK is the first country to do that. That's great. The European Union has done something similar. And we want the US to do that next. But it might take 5, 10, 15 years to happen.
And
but
at the very least, it's making it more difficult for those who are doing that. And the warning for them is, we're coming after you.
Absolutely.
We will not be there yet, we are coming there.
And that's been the theme of this conference. And it's an important theme, is how do we end impunity? So, you know, if you're a corrupt official and you think, I can get away with this, then, you know, there's a strong chance that a lot of officials will do that. If you know the world's watching you, if you know law enforcement can come after you, if you know it's very difficult to hide the money you've stolen and spend it, then it's less likely you'll do it.
Apart from laws enacted in constitutions and all that, have technology really helped you guys at Global Witness? Because now even super wizardry of a 15-year-old's good with computers, they can go and break this code and find the trail and all that. Or is it working for the other guys, the bad guys on that?
It should work for the good guys, and you know, part of the work around getting this list of who owns companies around the world means that you know, if technology can help give access to people around the world information for who owns companies. So, for example, you know, if you're a citizen in a country that has corrupt rulers, you will be able to search, you know, on open databases for whether they own companies that have been awarded big contracts. Journalists in countries will be able to do that. So actually the availability of data and technology that's accessible, that means that people can kind of access that data, means that, you know, improvements in technology should benefit anti-corruption campaigners and citizens of countries who are concerned about, you know, the money that their country raises and the budget their government has to spend on things. You know, if they're concerned about how that's spent, then technology should be able to help them if governments agree to publish information in a way that's accessible, and that's part of the fight.
Cool. I have to go for the last break, but once we are back, I want to move on to, before we end, I want to move on to the part where, you know, it's so easy to think like the movies in the 80s, some banana republic somewhere, you know, people don't even have tarred road, but the leader is in a huge limousine and brandishing gold weaponries and all that. But we know that the world have moved on to very sophisticated level where it seems like just anyone else. He or she might look like a movie star. This person who has siphoned off millions, if not billions, and all this. So how do we move on with the time in fighting this? Because like I said in another interview, when I was discussing subprime crisis, look, the term subprime is you're not a prime target, or you are not well enough financially for us to give you a loan. But then it was created that, never mind, we give you a loan. But what we get from there, even if you don't pay, is that we have moved up the value chain. We have put together new financial instruments. So the very terminology of corruption now has got to work with sophisticated instruments and stuff. And, you know, it's not as easy as, oh, I have oil in my country, it's 10 billion a year, and I just give one back, but the other 9 I'm putting in Switzerland or whatever else. You get what I mean? It is getting more complex and more sophisticated. Sometimes we don't even know if we can call it corruption, but we know somewhere that that's not right. So how do you look at that from an awareness point of view around the world? And how do you keep up with the pace of changes that's happening? That we'll discuss after this short break. You are still watching a specially recorded session of Agenda AWANI on the sideline of a very, very important international meet called IACC. It's the fight against corruption. Anti-corruption stakeholders are all here in Putrajaya, and I'm so glad. I'm going to continue with Stuart, who's from Global Witness. We've talked about the flow of money, we've talked about the banks, talked about the regulations, but we know it's not that simple anymore. It's not as simple as a corrupt leader somewhere in the Banana Republic, somewhere that we don't know about. Now it has gone complex. And more, the economies of the world are driven by the private sector, not the public sector. So how do you move with this? Because I want to throw this back to you, because you're in London, and that's one of the biggest financial centers of the world. Subprime crisis in 2007, 2008, for example. The name subprime means that, you know, if I'm a subprime candidate, I shouldn't be getting loans, but I have been getting loans. So how do we look at the new instruments and all this? Because it's not as simple as taking people's money anymore. There are new ways and seemingly non-dangerous ways of taking people's money, because I don't even know that that was what was happening.
Yeah, it's you know, a very, very good point, and it's an important subject. And I think what underlies you know, a lot of the rule breaking by banks is the fact that, you know, they have the wrong incentives. You know, the main incentive is to make money, but they don't have the incentive to, like, follow the rules to make sure they're not doing things which are harmful to society and harmful to, you know, people all around the world. And that's one of the themes of our report, is that, you know, regulators aren't properly overseeing banks, and so this behaviour is allowed to happen. So it's not just that corrupt officials are moving their money through the financial system, which is, you know, as you said, is a terrible situation, but also, you know, organised gangs, drug cartels, human traffickers. All sorts of criminals are able to hide and spend the fruits of, you know, their crimes, because banks aren't doing their job in spotting this, and because regulators aren't giving banks a disincentive to stop doing that. So if the regulators did a good job, and if governments did a good job in overseeing banks, then they would be sticking with the rules, and a whole host of crime that really, you know, harms citizens all around the world, whether that's someone in London, someone in the Democratic Republic of Congo, someone in Kuala Lumpur. You know, banks could do a lot better at protecting them, and regulators need to enforce the rules to give them the incentives so they're behaving properly, and we're not seeing the type of predatory capitalism that, you know, you've just talked about.
In that sense, maybe the awareness should be focusing on, fine, the banks are big, they are powerful, we're talking about trillions of US dollars here, and if we can quote the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the estimation of amount of money laundered globally each year is 2 to 5% of global GDP, and that's 800 billion to 2 trillion US dollars. So the incentive for the other side to keep on doing what they are doing is very, very lucrative. However, maybe from the Global Witness side and maybe at the IACC, if we can have a simple thing as an app or a place of information where we can go to that. If I want to look, for example, if I was going for a holiday, this might be one of the key information I should have. The banking system in this country, many of the banks are not following this. So that give an idea to people, you know, bringing it down to the 5-foot level, as I like to call it, to the pavement of this big fight that you're fighting. How do you think we're doing that? And do you think that we are successful at increasing awareness? And at IACC, I think this is where the discourse is. Part of it is thinking on how else do we put all this out so that people are our best ally to fight against this?
That's a really good question, and you know, there's been some fascinating insights here at the conference. You're right, and one really interesting example was a situation in Kenya where there's now kind of websites and software that if you know, a policeman asks you to pay a bribe, you can take a photo or record that and post it onto a site. And that's a really great way of tackling corruption at that level. And I love the idea. I think it's a great idea that, you know, people should have information about which banks are the good banks and the bad banks, and help, you know, that would help customers to choose banks then and put customer pressure on the banks to improve. I think you're absolutely right. And I think a more macro level, there's lots of things that could be done. So, for example, one campaign that's being worked on is to get all big oil, gas and mining companies to publish how much they pay to government. So citizens in those countries can see what the deals are, and they can see if any money is going missing, and that will hold their governments to account. And Global Witness and other organisations have campaigned on for those laws to be introduced into the US and into Europe as well. There's a lot of fight back, a huge amount of fight back from the oil industry in the US to try and prevent that from happening.
I'm glad you said that, because I want to end the discussion with that. Maybe you can paint the picture from your point of view. Of course, there's only you in the discussion. How hard is this fight? Because we know that there will be fightbacks, and they are powerful forces that you have to contend with. And if we take the extreme end of the estimation, they have $2 trillion behind them.
It's you know, at times it's a very difficult fight because there are lots of vested interests. So banks stand to make a lot of money from taking the proceeds of corruption and other laundered money. And oil companies are fighting hard. A lot of oil companies are fighting hard. Do they sue
Global Witness?
They do lots of different things, and they lobby quite hard. They lobby governments quite hard. The US has introduced a law, and the oil companies keep trying to fight that. They keep trying to fight various different rulings to prevent that from coming into force. So it's mainly through lobby and argument, but they keep presenting the same arguments at the same time, and try and find new people to listen. But they are very powerful organisations with lots of money. But what we know is that if we can get the message out there and actually present the truth of what's happening, then decision makers can be won over. And the battle is getting the message out there, you know, and we think the truth will out.
I'm truly indebted for you. I would like to say, for you being here, I would like to say thank you on behalf of Malaysians everywhere that's watching this, because yes, we have to balance what you say and find, you know, check on the credibility of Global Witness. But I guess it's very transparent. I got this report on banks and dirty money on the website of Global Witness, so you guys can go there. So thank you so much, Stuart, and our prayers are with you. Go on fighting corruption for all of us who might not have the wherewithal, like you and your friends in Global Witness. Thank you so much for making time to be on Agenda Awani. Thanks to you for watching. Hantarkan pandangan anda sendiri kepada pelbagai platform yang Astro Awani ada. Semua ada Instagram, YouTube, Twitter dan sebagainya. Dan buat turun aplikasi mudah alih iOS dan Android, kerana ia telus untuk memberikan anda siaran langsung dan juga anda boleh memberikan komen dan kritikan anda. Sekian, selamat malam, terima kasih. Jumpa lagi, dan sebelum saya terlupa, terima kasih kepada MACC kerana membolehkan kami merakamkan episod-episod seperti ini di sisi persidangan yang begitu penting IACC. Sekian, selamat malam, jumpa lagi.